Hello and welcome back to the Developing Solutions with Sitecore Print Experience Manager video training series. In this video, which is a continuation of our implementation tasks, we're actually going to go into Visual Studio and develop some custom renderers to handle the author information on that page. So the big question is, why do we need a custom renderer on that page? And the simple reason is this, is that when we put an article on that page in the PXM project, a lot of the information exists within that article content item, the title, the body, the abstract, for example. However, some of the information that's key to that article is actually coming from a lookup field, which is the contributors field. So there are two ways to handle this. First way, we could either have two snippets, one that has the article information and the other that has the author information. But in this case here, for usability reasons and for other reasons, we want it to simply have one snippet. And so you drag and drop that article across and everything updates on the page, including information coming from other content items like the contributors content item. So we're going to go ahead and make that. As we're looking at the source document, we'll ask ourselves some questions. Does this need to handle multiple authors? And then we'll look at the actual Visual Studio project. Launch Sitecore does a service for us in creating that Visual Studio project for us to work through, so we can simply reuse that. In the real world, if you're developing PXM projects, often you'll want to make a separate Visual Studio project, or you could just use the Visual Studio project associated with your Sitecore site. So we're going to create the code. There are a few key concepts, including understanding the difference between the data item, that is the underlying content that you're trying to access, and the rendering item, and that is the properties of the text frame or image frame that you're displaying on the page. We're going to add those custom renderers to PXM to be used, and we'll be applying those custom renderers to the images and text frames on that page. So first off, let's look at the source document as well as the content within our Launch Sitecore site. So you can see here in the document, there are some cases where there's a number of authors on a page. And this is something where if this is in your information architecture and it's common and possible at all to have a number of content authors for a single item, then that needs to be encapsulated in your renderer. So in that case there, you'd probably go through and write something that would iterate through a number of different authors and build out something like a table or something with inlines on this page. We're going to keep this fairly simple for our demonstration, so we realize and accept the fact that we don't want to be able to deal with multiple authors and renderers. And if we look back at our Launch Sitecore content itself, you can only really have one author tagged with that content. And so that's what we'll do, is we'll take our cue from the content, that is every article was written and authored by one individual, and so that's what we'll render on the page. And we'll basically accept the fact that what's in the document provided to us from the designer is an edge case. But these are the types of things that you do need to look through and research as you're building out your information architecture, and make sure it accommodates all of those cases that you would come across within your document. And similarly, in anything that you do for custom renderers or what you're rendering out onto a page, you want to make sure that it handles edge cases gracefully. Okay, so I've gone ahead into InDesign and I've loaded the PXM project that we've been working on. So that is Launch Sitecore article, and I've loaded the project here into my project tab, and I've also in turn loaded the project onto the page. And we can see here some of the content is coming from Sitecore content items, so our abstract and our body. But of course, this information here is still static content. We still have a static content reference to the author and their title, and we still have a static content reference that's actually missing to the image. And so we're going to go ahead and make custom renderers to handle all three of these items. Now, in order to do that, we'll go to Visual Studio here, and we're pretty fortunate in that there is already a project associated with the Launch Sitecore package. And so if you open that in Visual Studio, you can then see this here. And what we're going to do is we're going to associate this with Sitecore Rocks. If you don't have Sitecore Rocks installed, it's not mandatory for the PXM development. However, it does make your life a lot easier, especially as we get into workflow rule actions. So I recommend installing it, but again, it's not necessary. When you do install it, it does add this tab here to Sitecore. And so we're going to create a new connection here. And we're going to pick PXM training. And ensure that we are associating that with our PXMH training website directory. And we'll test that, and it will prompt us to install the Launch Sitecore more advanced web services, the Hard Rock web server. So we will do that, and we will update all of that. And of course, this will recycle our Sitecore site. Okay, so now that we've done that, we have our PXM training connection here within our connections in Sitecore Explorer, and that is associated with our Launch Sitecore project. So we're going to go ahead and add a new folder. We're going to call this PXM, and then within the folder, we're going to add a new folder called renderers. And then here, we're going to create a new item. This is just a CSS class, and we're going to call this XML lookup textframe.cs and add that. Now what we're going to do here is we're going to inherit from the standard XML text frames that we're using within PXM. You probably want to use something like Reflector or ILSpy to look at the existing classes from PXM that we're inheriting from. And what we're going to do is we're going to override that property, which is GetDataItem, because instead of getting the content item, which is the article that's being displayed on the page, we want to open a field within that article, which is the contributors field, and go and get the contents of that contributor. So we can get the person's name, we can get their title, and we can get their image. So we're going to go ahead and do that now. Okay, so we're going to start here by adding a couple references into our project. We're going to add the Print Studio Publishing reference. So we're going to go to Browse and go to my PXM training project website bin and all the way down to sitecore.printstudio.publishingengine. So we're going to go ahead and use that and say OK. And we're going to add that here into our class. And then at this point, this allows us to override something. So I'm going to say we're going to override the XML text frame renderer. This will come along with all the properties of normal text frame rendering because, of course, we are in the end rendering out a text frame. We want to render out that person's username. We want to render out their title. But in this case here, we're going to override the GetDataItem functionality. And GetDataItem is really a base class that's across all rendering that simply uses the information within the Sitecore rendering item of that data source and goes to that data source and gets the content. So if we go back here to our project and look at something like the title field and we scroll down, you can see that there's this item reference field and this item field. And so what GetDataItem is doing is it's simply getting this value from that item reference field and pulling that into a Sitecore item object. And so what we're going to do is we're going to customize this to allow us to pass a parameter, and that parameter is going to be called lookup field. And so what this is going to do is override GetDataItem. It's going to open up this item, but then in turn look at our lookup value parameter that we're going to take, which is contributors, and it's going to open the contributors item, and that's going to be our new GetDataItem. So we're going to go into the code and add that now. So first things first, on our class, we're going to add this lookup field. This is going to allow us to enter a parameter on that Sitecore item and receive the parameter into our code. Next, we're going to do the override itself. And so in this case here, we're using item. That is a Sitecore item type, so we're going to resolve that. Print context is coming from our publishing engine, so we're going to resolve that. And we have Sitecore utilities, and we'll add Sitecore data fields. And so at this point here, we're now overriding the GetDataItem functionality. Normally, it just simply takes that data source field and goes and does a lookup. But in our case here, we're extending that to first do that lookup, but then apply our additional lookup field functionality, which is to allow the developer to pass a value into that lookup field and, of course, go and get the data as referenced by that lookup field. So we're going to save this, and we'll go back to Sitecore here, and this is the author field, and so really we're going to scroll down and we're going to add the parameter lookup value, or lookup field, sorry. And the field that we're going to look up is the contributors field. And so now this will be passed, and we will in fact go to that source Sitecore item and go to that contributors field, and we're going to get the content item for Mike Casey in this case, and that's what we're going to be using. And then at that point we can start to get the fields associated with Mike Casey, the image, the title, the job description, his name, all that sort of information. So that's really what we're doing. And so we've got the code there. We've customized this to receive a parameter. We've got that parameter in our author text frame that's being passed. It's giving us our contributors field. And then at this point, you can now save this and build this, and we'll go back to Sitecore. Okay, so Sitecore does need to recycle because we have done a compile, and so it will take a minute to load. But what we'll do now is we'll go to Print Studio and the libraries and our renderers library. And here we'll make a new folder. We call it custom. And I'm actually going to make a copy of the text frame renderer. And you can see here the text frame renderer is referencing a class and a method. I'm just going to copy it here and call this lookup text frame XML renderer. And the properties are as follows. My namespace, or sorry, my class is launch Sitecore, so that will go to the right of the comma there. My full namespace is launch Sitecore PXM renderers, so I will do that, and that is my namespace. And then my actual method is XML lookup text frame, so I will select that, and I will save that. If your type doesn't exist, let's say launch Sitecore lookup text frame 2, you'll generally get an error here in your type class. So it'll basically say, oh, that doesn't exist, and you receive a validation notification on that. But in our case here, we've got it here, and that is correct. So this renderer is now usable. There are two ways of applying a custom renderer. The first way is manually, so we can go back to our Print Studio project and go all the way down to our author, And if we go to the Content tab, we can now see our custom renderer in the renderers library, and that's fantastic. And so it's doing a lookup field pull from the contributors, but we need to also have an item field defined. And so we'll go to our team, and this is going to be pulling a value from Mike Casey, and it's really the title that we want. We want to get his title, and that's effectively his name. So we'll go back to the author and say our item field is title. So now when we go back to InDesign and load this content, instead of loading the static content, which is pulling from this static content item, we now have an item reference that's set correctly, and it is running through our custom lookup text frame renderer, going to that contributors field and getting the title of Mike Casey and putting that onto the page. So now when we go back to InDesign and load this project, we're going to see the content associated with Brandon Royal. In this case, he's the author of the Sitecore user interfaces article. If we go and pick a different bit of content, so let's say the launch Sitecore site, and drag and drop that across, you'll see that we have the content associated with Mike Casey for that site. And so that's really what we're doing, is getting those content references through the lookup. And so we'll take this, we'll go a little bit further, we'll make another copy of this author frame in order to capture the author title, and then we'll also make another custom renderer for our image, which is going on this page. It's very similar to the custom renderer for the lookup text. Really the only difference is that instead of rendering out to an XML text frame renderer, we're rendering out to an XML image renderer, and that's the only difference. Functionally speaking, they're the same, and so we're just overriding that out of the box renderer that's now associated with images. So we won't go through that exercise because it's a fairly repetitive process, but I'll show you the end result and just show you the additional classes that was made now. So at this point here, I've just skipped to the end because all the content and other changes we've already covered. So I've added another text frame called job title. This was made really just by making a copy of the author frame and changing the text reference to be the job title information instead of the title, which is the person's name. And we've also implemented the XML lookup image. Again, all the code is identical. The only difference is we're inheriting from the XML image renderer, because all the other stuff associated with the XML image renderer, the correct X and the Y coordinates, sizing, scaling, etc., those things don't apply to a text frame. And so that's all we're changing is the source of that inheritance. Again, we've gone back to Sitecore. We've added those custom renderers. We've created the new job title. We've added the item field on that job title as well. And so when we first developed this, I showed you the method of manually associating a renderer, and we did that also because we're adding parameters within our text frame items as well. The other way to change renderer associations is to do that within InDesign itself. And so if we go to our renderers library, we can now see that our custom renderers are available here as well. So if we want to see what our standard text frame renderer looked like, we can go and drag that, and you can see, there is no job title field associated with the Sitecore user interfaces article. So I'll put my lookup renderer back, and we'll see that there. Similarly, if I drag my standard text frame renderer here, we're seeing the title for the Sitecore user interfaces, which is what we're expecting. But our lookup field, which is looking at the contributors, goes and gets the title for the underlying contributor, who is Brandon Royal. And so renderers can also be a powerful tool, not just for your developers who are creating these things, but also for your designers. You can do renderers to do a lot of stuff within InDesign, build table elements, build complex things, pull information from databases. They're very flexible, and especially the fact that they're available within InDesign as well. So these aren't just a developer tool, they can also be a tool for developers to build things to help designers. So the last thing I'm going to do here is we were overriding GetDataItem in order to change the underlying reference. The other item or method that you often use is GetRenderingItem. And what GetRenderingItem does is it gets the item in your PXM project. So that would be the text frame or the image frame. That's really useful, especially for getting things like the properties. So if we were doing GetRenderingItem, we could get things like the name, the description, the attributes. And these are often things that you're going to be taking and transforming. And so those are really the two common methods. GetDataItem, which you'll commonly override if you're doing things like lookups, which is a very common thing in PXM, or this.renderingItem, which will allow you to get rendering information associated with the attributes of that layout that's going into that InDesign document. You don't need to use GetRenderingItem to retrieve parameters. That's already done for you in the parameters that you can get and set within your class. But that's really it for simple PXM development. We've built a renderer, we've applied it to Sitecore content items, and we've seen what the output looks like. And lastly, we've seen that you can use those renderers within the extensions tab within InDesign as well. And so that's it for core development concepts. There's an optional video on PXM debugging and using the XML viewer that I'll add, or you can skip directly to some of the advanced PXM development tasks.